Alright class, today we're going to start Macroeconomics, Unit 4A. And for the purposes of the course this year, since we are constrained by time and access to resources and in-person classes, it's important to note that really understanding Macroeconomics Unit 4A and Unit 4B, which will be next, are the most important parts of this course for the rest of the year. Along with Microeconomics, which was Unit 2, and Macroeconomics, which is Unit 4A and 4B, those are the two units or the two areas of study that you'll want to be very focused on in terms of preparing yourself for next year's schooling and education beyond in economics. So with that being said, please take special note of this unit, and we'll take our time doing this unit, and we'll ensure that we don't rush through anything. If we don't get to our last unit, then that's fine, but we'll take our time to make sure we understand all of macroeconomic theory. So today we're going to look at how to evaluate GDP as a statistic, being able to calculate GDP growth and understand the difference between micro and macroeconomics, as well as the positive and negative effects of GDP as a stat. Hopefully you'll be able to come away from today's lesson understanding how to calculate GDP, understanding what GDP is, as well as to discuss and be able to talk about what are some of the drawbacks of GDP as a stat. Obviously, completion and review of homework is also very important. So if we start today's conversation, we still want to review and understand what is this concept of economics. Economics being the study of the way a society makes decisions about scarce resources. And so for our conversations to date, we've been talking only in microeconomic terms. We've been talking about how individual farms may choose between what crop to produce, or you as an individual will choose what thing to consume, or how much to work, or what to do with your very limited viewpoint of the world. And as an individual in high school, as a consumer, we tend to often think about the world in microeconomic terms. But it's very important to understand how the microeconomic world and society we live in actually lives within a larger macroeconomic thought process, a larger macroeconomic perspective. And so we need to understand that the macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole, while microeconomics is all these little different parts of the economy, individual companies, individual decisions. Macroeconomics will talk about larger policy things, larger organizations that are global in nature or entire countries. And so to understand these two concepts, we need to understand the difference between how we view the two things. And so if I ask you a question, what is this? What do you see? Most people are probably going to say that they see a tree. But is this really a tree? How can you know that that's my intention of what I'm asking? Perhaps I really want to know if you can see that there is a tree, yet beyond that tree you can see a larger picture of an entire forest, right? And so to understand an individual as they talk about something small, where does that small thing lie and involve the rest of the economy, or how does it impact the rest of the economy, or where does it fit into the rest of the economy? Or if I'd ask you, what is this thing? It's very hard to decipher what this very pixelated picture looks like. All these small little pixels, it's hard to determine what that image looks like because you're looking at such a narrow viewpoint of the world. In microeconomics, you may look at yourself as the individual. You may look at yourself as, well, if it's good for me, it's good for the whole world. That's a very kind of fallacy of composition way of looking at the world. And so it's very microeconomic, very individualistic, very self-serving. Whereas that pixel is part of a much larger picture, right? It's part of the picture of this painting's eye, right? To understand that we make decisions individually, but they are individual in nature as part of a larger whole. So can you see the forest through the trees, or the trees for the forest? Can you see each individual pixel as it looks like a larger picture in a monitor? So that's why it's important to understand microeconomics, but to understand that we are not alone in this society, that we need to understand where do our decisions and viewpoints impact a greater thought process. And so when we talk about macroeconomics, we look at three main indicators. One is output, two is employment, and three is price stability. And so today we're going to be talking about output and GDP. Our next video lesson will be about employment, and our third video lesson will be about price stability and inflation. And so these are the three main economic indicators. And these three things typically are what you're going to see in the news. Every politician, every news outlet is going to talk about these three things and talk about how these three things reflect or show us how good is our economy doing. Okay, and so someone will say GDP has grown, GDP is shrinking, employment is going up, employment is going down, prices are going up, prices are going down. And so if you look at our current state of the economy with COVID-19 happening, with the gas prices dropping, GDP is going down. We're entering what many think is going to be a long recession. Employment is dropping or unemployment is rising. Prices are becoming less stable. And so we are turning and running into a moment in time where, in a macroeconomic sense, we are seeing some fairly negative indicators. And so usually economists, individuals, news outlets are going to look at these three things to determine what do we think about society in this moment in time. And so understanding what these things mean is gonna help you understand how an economy is performing. So what is this thing we call GDP? We've already talked about it in Unit 3 a little bit. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. So how much stuff is being produced or done or created within our country. So that's domestic and product being the stuff and gross being all of it. Okay, so gross domestic product equals consumer spending, investment spending in capital investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. And so it measures our economic activity of a nation. Again, as a reminder, we talked about this in Unit 3. It only measures the final value of all goods and services produced within a country. It only measures the final output, not double counting the factors of production or, selling the coffee beans to the coffee wholesaler who sells it to the coffee retailer. It's only the final value. So, for our purposes, we know that you understand economics as a consumer, okay, as an expenditure. As someone who buys something, you're going to spend money on a drink. You're going to spend money on a bicycle. That's your expenditure, and that's typically how most of you have experienced the world of economics. Some of you have started to get jobs, and so your jobs are going to start paying you income, and so GDP can be calculated by adding up all the expenditures of every individual, so the total money spent on all final goods and services, which is the equation that we've already been looking at, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Or we can actually look at GDP as the income approach, adding up all the income that anyone has ever or is receiving for all these things, goods and services that is being produced within a country. Okay, and so the question is, do these two methods calculate the same value? Your answer should be yes, because if you look at expenditure, if you buy a drink for $2, who are you paying? You're paying the retailer who is going to take some of that money because they've marked up the price, so they'll get a little bit of that money. So they'll get a little bit of income. The retailer has to buy that drink from a wholesaler or from Costco or somewhere, and so they have to pay Costco, and so Costco is going to make a little bit of money. And Costco has to get that drink from Pepsi or from Coke or from whatever company they're buying their drinks from, and so that company will get a little bit of money. And Coca-Cola has to pay their workers, has to pay their, whoever they buy their syrup from, the bottling company, all these kinds of things. And so any person who makes money from that purchase is also income. And so every dollar you spend is actually income for someone else. Okay, so our income and our expenditure approaches to GDP should equal the same amount, which would give us a consistent value. But for our purposes, we're probably going to spend most of our time talking about the expenditure approach because that's the one that's you're more used to and probably a little bit easier to understand at this point in time. So when we talk about GDP, what do the news outlets talk about? What do they say? What are they concerned about? They're concerned about how is GDP growing. Because if GDP stays still, it means our economy is not getting bigger. And typically, we always want to see our economy grow. We want to see how is Canada doing today versus how did Canada do last year versus how did Canada do the year before. In the past 10 years, we've gone through an unprecedented amount of GDP growth, right? Well, the whole world has gone through lots and lots of growth, um, and GDP is going up and up and up and up. But now we've just hit a big hurdle, and GDP is going to slow down significantly. And so we want to see how much is GDP growing, because that's a sign of economic growth and prosperity and economic health. So if we look at GDP growth, you want to calculate GDP, which it currently is, minus what you're looking at GDP before, whether it's last year, whether it's 2 years ago, whatever time frame you're looking at, divided by GDP before, times 100%, and that should give you a growth of GDP. And this is just a standard growth formula that you should have encountered in a science class, perhaps, or a math class. Um, so my question to you is, how valuable is this stat? How good is this stat if you're just looking at GDP growth, you're just looking at expenditure, right? Remember, we're calculating GDP as how much has been spent or expended in our economy by whomever is buying things, consumers, investment, government, exports minus imports. And so if prices of goods had all gone up, what does that mean? That means that today, your cell phone that cost $100 or $1,000, I should say, um, that same cell phone maybe tomorrow or next year costs $1,100. Or that same tank of fuel that you bought today, which is now, let's say, 75 cents per liter, 2 months ago was $1.20 per liter. So prices can go up and they can go down. And how is that going to impact our GDP growth calculation? If prices had gone up significantly, that means our GDP growth statistic would be overstated. And what do I mean by overstated? It means that it will tell us that GDP has grown more than it actually has. And so we need to use some terminology called real GDP and nominal GDP to ensure that we are looking at this properly. And so let's just give you an example. So let's say that last year GDP was $15 billion, okay? And if this year GDP is $17 billion, our GDP has gone up $2 billion, okay? And so if we put it into our calculation, we say GDP this year is 17 billion minus GDP last year of 15 billion divided by GDP last year of 15 billion times 100% gives us a growth rate of GDP of 13.3%, okay? And that's enormous, right? And so if we just looked at that for what it's worth, it says that our GDP, our economy, our output has grown by 13.3%. But what if that year prices had just gone up 13.3%? Everything that cost you $100 before 1 year ago now costs you $113.3, right? Everything that you bought now is just more expensive. And so if that happened, it would have looked like our GDP had actually grown by 13.3%. But in reality, did our country produce any more? Did our country create any more wealth? Did our country have any more economic activity than it did a year before? It actually didn't. It's just that prices had gone up and everything had gotten more expensive. And therefore, that's why we need to use the concept of real GDP versus nominal GDP. And so real GDP is calculated using constant dollar calculations. So we want to calculate GDP removing the impacts of inflation or deflation to see how much did economic activity actually change. And so if I say real GDP had grown by 5% this year, that's a better question versus just saying GDP or even saying nominal GDP. Nominal GDP would just be that straight 13.3% growth rate, or that 17 to 15 billion. That's nominal GDP. That does not include removing of a price change, because we need to remove the price change to ensure that we are getting an accurate view on did our economy actually grow or shrink or change. So to this question, if I said that real GDP had grown 5% this year, can you assume that the economy is in fact better off? Okay, so think a minute to yourself and think about, well, real GDP has gone up 5%. 5% is a really good growth rate. It's substantial. Is our economy better? Economic activity has grown. there's more wealth in our nation. There's probably more jobs. People are spending more. There's more activity in general. So, does my conclusion tell me, yes, we are better off? It depends on how you look at it, actually. Because we need to really look at what is GDP measuring. GDP is measuring growth through spending and output. And so my question to you is, does that mean our economy is better off, right? And we're trying to figure out uh, what is our economy and what does it mean for our economy to be better off. Just saying our economy has spent more, done more, uses more, is that enough? Um, let's see. Um, what about the welfare or well-being of society? That's a fairly large point that we haven't even looked at, right? We don't know if our economy is better off because we don't know if our spending and output growing is actually making our economy better. And so those are some things that we need to think about. So if we're looking at the GDP as a statistic and understand that we haven't looked yet at our well-being of our citizens, it's very important to hear this quote from a politician in the United States. It says this. This is for page 202 of your textbooks. GNP/GDP counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, an ambulance to clear our roads or highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for those who break them. It counts the destruction of our redwoods. If the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And this is by Robert Kennedy. So that quote should tell you a little bit about what GDP does count and what it doesn't. It's not to say that we should discount this as a statistic, but just to understand exactly what is it saying. It is just saying that output has increased or decreased. It is not talking about some of the other factors that we will look at a little bit later in this course. And so with that being said, it's important to look at what are the things that are drawbacks to this stat called GDP. One, the underground economy is not reported. Um, whatever you believe about the underground economy, whether you believe about the drug trade or cash deals, things like that, um, that's not reportable. It's not reported to our government, so it's not counted in GDP. So we may have a burgeoning underground economy that is influencing our economic activity. It is increasing in value in what's happening, but that's not being accounted for in the GDP stats. Non-market production, housewives, house husbands, volunteer hours. Um, I would venture to say the more volunteering that our nation does, likely is a good indicator of a health of a society. Um, but our volunteer hours are not counted in GDP. These people are doing things without getting paid. They're not contributing to economic activity that is counted for by the government. Yet, those are good things. Those are valuable pieces of information that GDP just does not look at. Doesn't measure equity, right? How is this wealth circulated? How is this wealth distributed amongst our people, right? We looked at goals of an economy. Our goals of an economy talk about equitable distribution of income. GDP is not talking about per is everyone making more. It's just saying, is our entire country doing more, making more? That could be very focused in the hands of a few. The next one is environmental. Remember we talked about if we focus too much on productive efficiency, we focus too much on profit making, we're likely to do things that are going to cause third-party costs. We're likely going to do things that are sacrificing the future of our economy, sacrificing the future of our nation. We may be polluting, we may be clear-cutting forests, we may be overfishing fisheries. There are so many things that companies, individuals, people, governments, politics may do that may damage our nation, damage our environment, just for productive activity. You think about things like when Trump talks about wanting to stop this lockdown due to COVID. because he wants the economy to start growing again, the economy to start moving, yet willing to sacrifice lives for that to happen. Um, it's not an ideal thing when you are too focused on what does our GDP say? What's our GDP doing? Yes, people will lose their jobs, and that is a problem. But what are you willing to sacrifice to get that back, right? Next is population size. What if we open our borders to immigration? We're gonna, see thousands and thousands of people come in for immigration. That's gonna raise our GDP. Um, but is our GDP per person going up? Are those individuals bringing our average GDP per person down, or actually are they bringing it up? If you look at some nations where their GDP starts to stagnate, they'll want to bring in individuals from other countries to help prop that up. One of the immigration questions that they give, they talk about how much wealth will you bring into a nation, how much education do you have, how much are you going to contribute to our society. Every nation wants individuals coming in that are going to help grow the society, grow output, grow economic activity, versus be a drag on it. And that's not to say that we should not bring in individuals who might need shelter, refugees, or whatnot, but countries do want to bring in individuals who will contribute positively to the nation. Next is types of goods. The quote that we just read talks about this. Car crashes, divorce lawyers, all those things are economic. It is economic activity. Yet, do we want those things in our output? If we think about the legalization of marijuana, is more cannabis going to be sold and bought and increase our economic activity? Probably. Are we happy with that? Are we happy with more drug use? Right? These are questions that you have to ask. What do you want your society to be known for? What do you want to be out there? Right? Do you want more people doing these different things just for the sake of an increase in GDP? Distribution of income we've already talked about. Leisure and productivity. If I go on vacation and I don't make any money, is that good for me? Is that good for our nation? Right? Those kinds of things, again, similar to volunteer or housewives, house husbands, those kinds of things are not counted for in terms of economic activity. And so we have to be very careful in terms of how we view this as a stat. We just have to do exactly that. GDP is a statistic. Nothing more, nothing less. Understanding what GDP is, understanding what it says is important to understanding how can you glean information or analysis and conclusions from this stat. Um, GDP has value, but all statistics have limitations. That is our lesson on GDP. I hope it made sense. Please send me messages if you have any questions, and I will address them as soon as possible. Thank you.